What if I told you there's a tiny old man that gets you to 7 mana by turn 4 and lets you start dropping huge threats before anyone is ready? Bugenhagen, Wise Elder. Bugenhagen is essentially a legendary 2 mana dork, and at first glance that might sound really underwhelming for a commander, but what he enables is one of the most unique and satisfying concepts that I've ever showcased. The 2/4/7 mana curve, because Bugenhagen is always going to be available in the command zone, we'll always be able to play him on turn 2, which means that if we don't miss any land drops, we'll always have 4 mana available by turn 3, which will then allow us to cast a 4 mana ramp spell to put 2 additional lands on the battlefield. And by the time we get to our turn 4, we can just play an additional land and suddenly we will have 7 mana available. So while our opponents will still be setting up their boards, we're already going to be dropping massive 7-drop creatures that our opponents just aren't ready to deal with yet. Now at first this might sound like a bit of a one-trick strategy, but in reality it is incredibly consistent, because no one is going to waste a removal spell on your 2 mana commander, and no one is ever going to counter your ramp spell on turn 3, which means this setup is almost guaranteed to happen and will give you a huge mana advantage really early in the game. And on top of that, Bugenhagen also comes with a very simple but very solid passive ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you get to draw a card. And especially thanks to our 2/4/7 mana curve, we will easily be able to get a 7 power creature on the battlefield from as early as turn 4, which our Bugenhagen will then translate into some really consistent card draw. And since we are a mono green deck, we'll happily take any form of extra card draw we can get. Now for this list, I decided to build it on a €100 budget, because this deck is totally able to dominate pots without breaking the bank. But if you head over to the Moxfield Primer, I also included a full upgrade section if you do want to push our old man to its absolute limits. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 6 categories: the 4 mana acceleration, our big threats, card draw, support, protection and interaction, and the lands. And let's start by talking about our 4 cost acceleration spells, because these are the cards that make this entire strategy work. By ramping us to a total of 7 mana by turn 4, they do allow us to drop our massive threats way ahead of our opponents. In total, we're running 14 of these spells, and there's a really good reason for that. If you do the math, 14 is essentially a magic number that will give us a very high chance to get at least one of these spells in our opening hand. And that is exactly what we're looking for, because the ideal opening hand for this deck is really simple. You want to have at least 3 lands and 1 of our 4 mana acceleration spells. That's all you'll ever need to consistently set up our 2/4/7 curve and start snowballing from as early as turn 4. And let's start with the most basic one of these spells, Explosive Vegetation. For 4 mana on sorcery speed, we get to search our library for 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Nothing fancy, just enabling us to get that 7 mana we want by turn 4. Now while obviously that is the main reason why we're playing these spells, they do all have one additional benefit, and that is that they will thin our deck by removing the lands from it, meaning that in the late game the chances of you drawing an actual relevant card instead of just another basic land you don't need are gonna be way higher. The next cards will all be variations on this effect, but they do all come with a slight little benefit. Vastwood Search, which in addition to being a 4 mana acceleration spell, also has the kicker ability for 4 mana, which means if we do cast a spell for a total of 8 mana on top of getting those 2 basic lands, we will also get to put 2 additional +1/+1 counters on all of our creatures, making it into a really good spell we can just cast on turn 3 for the acceleration, and later in the game, once you do have a gazillion mana available, it will even buff up your entire board. Sky Shroud Claim, another 4 mana spell that will fetch us up 2 forests, but unlike the other cards, they will enter untapped, which means they will immediately be able to be tapped for mana, and that 2 extra mana might just be enough to squeeze in a low cost removal spell or one of our card draw engines. New Generations Technique, a card with exactly the same effect as an Explosive Vegetation, but this time it also has the sneak mechanic, meaning that instead of paying its regular mana cost, you can return an unblocked attacker to your hand and cast it for its sneak cost. Now while the 1 mana cost reduction isn't really all that relevant in this deck, it does give give you a huge amount of utility, because later in the game, once you are swinging with a huge ETB creature, you can just return it to your hand by using the sneak mechanic of the spell, and then on a later turn you will just be able to recast it again and you will get another use out of its ETB ability. Map the Frontier. Instead of just giving you the option to go fetch up 2 basic lands, you can also fetch up deserts, which can come in really handy to go fetch up your scavenger grounds if you are playing against some graveyard based decks. Invasion of Zendikar. Whenever you cast this battle, you get to fetch up 2 basic lands and it will enter the battlefield under an opponent's control. Whenever you are then able to deal lethal damage to this battle, it will flip into its backside under your control, which is a 4/4 Vigilance Haste creature that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Now, while just the front side of this card would already be more than enough reason to include it in the deck, the fact that you can get some extra value in the form of an additional creature body by just dealing 3 damage to it is just absolutely fantastic. Encroaching Dragonstorm, a 4-mana enchantment that will fetch you up 2 basic lands, and whenever any dragon enters the battlefield under your control, this enchantment will just return to your hand. Now, even though we are a mono green deck, we are playing one specific dragon, and whenever you are able to cast that dragon and return this to your hand, the value is just incredible, because you will just be able to cast the spell again, and even though you are already at 7 mana, in the late game these spells are still quite relevant, because they will fetch you up even more lands, giving you access to more mana, enabling you to drop 2 big threats in a turn, and they will make sure you have a bigger chance to draw into some relevant cards later in the game by just thinning your deck of any lands. Migration Path, an explosive vegetation effect that also has the cycling ability, meaning that later in the game, once you already have a huge amount of lands on the battlefield and you don't need any additional acceleration, you can just pay 2 generic mana and discard this card and you will get to draw an additional card, just allowing you to dig a little deeper into your library. Verdant Mastery. Now, the wording on this card is quite convoluted, so let me just explain it to you really simple. It's a 6 mana spell that you can also cast for 4 mana. Whenever you do, you get to search your library for 4 basic land cards and put 2 of them onto the battlefield tapped, 1 of them in your hand, and you will also have to put 1 of those lands onto the battlefield under an opponent's control. Now, while that might seem like a really horrible thing to do, this card does generate you some crazy value, because on top of accelerating your mana by 2, you will also get to put a land card in your hand, just ensuring that you won't miss your next land drop, and it will filter a total of 4 land cards out of your deck, just really thinning it and increasing your chances of drawing relevant cards. And usually just giving that 1 extra land to an opponent really doesn't matter all that much in the grand scheme of things. And in the late game, if you are able to cast a spell for 6 mana, you will just get 2 basics onto the battlefield and 2 into your hand, totally removing the downside of accelerating one of your opponents. And now that we're talking about cards that will thin your deck like crazy, Planar Engineering. Whenever this spell resolves, you will have to sacrifice 2 of your lands, but you will get 4 basic lands in return, giving us exactly the same value as all of the other cards I've just been talking about, but on top of that, it will also filter a total of 4 lands out of your deck, which in a deck like this that's all about min-maxing the odds of us drawing into relevant cards is really good. Open the Way. For 2 green mana plus X, we get to reveal the top X cards of our library, and every land card we revealed will then be put onto the battlefield tapped. Now, already at its baseline, you can just cast this on turn 3 for 4 mana and it will have exactly the same effect as all of the previous spells, just giving you 2 free lands. And later in the game, you can get some incredible value out of the spell by just dumping additional mana into the X, and it will grab you up to 4 lands, because it does have a built-in restriction that the X cost of the spell can be greater than the amount of players in the game, so the maximum amount will always be 4. Alright, now that we got those out of the way, let's get into some of the more fancy acceleration options. Pot of Annihilation, a 4-mana enchantment that will enter the battlefield with 2 0/1 Eldrazi spawn tokens that you can sacrifice to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. And passively, this enchantment will also give all Eldrazi you control the ability that you can tap them to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, essentially turning them into mana dorks. Now, baseline, whenever you cast this enchantment, it will essentially enter with 2 Birds of Paradise, which will still enable us to cast this on turn 3 and get to that 7 mana by turn 4. But this thing actually enables a really explosive start, because on your turn 4 you can just tap the Eldrazi for mana, then you can sacrifice both of those tokens for an additional colorless mana, and you will have a total of 9 mana available on turn 4, which instead of just allowing you to drop a 7-drop creature really early in the game will now enable you to drop a 9-drop. And as you will see in the next section, we are playing some really deadly cards in the 9-drop slot. And passively, whenever we cast any creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, we also get to gain 4 life. And since we're playing a ton of high cost creatures in this deck, the life gain effect might actually come in quite handy. Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma. Instead of accelerating our mana by turn 4, instead he will reduce the cost of any creature we cast with power 4 or greater by 2 generic mana, which arguably makes him even better because if we are planning to cast multiple creatures in a turn, his cost reduction will apply to all of them. And while just that passive ability alone already makes him a great card for this deck, whenever Goreclaw attacks he will give a +1/+1 stat boost to your entire board, and they will also gain trample until the end of turn, which makes this card into both a really solid acceleration option and also a win condition on something as simple as a 4-drop creature. The most relevant part being the trample, because let's say you do control a total of 5 10/10 creatures. If you're then playing against a token player and they just have 5 simple 1/1 squirrels to block them with, you won't be able to get any damage through. And the trample keyword just totally solves that problem because your opponents won't be able to chum block your big boys anymore and you will always be able to get combat damage through. And a card I'm still currently testing out in this deck is an Arbor Adherent, which is a 4-drop creature that you can tap to add mana to your mana pool equal to the biggest amount of toughness amongst other creatures you control. Now baseline, you will always have your Bugenhagen on the field, and this creature will tap for at least 3 mana, which will give us a total of 8 mana on turn 4. And once you have one of your big boys on the battlefield, this card can be tapped for like 5, 6, 7 mana, giving this card a really high ceiling. Now the reason I mentioned I'm still testing this out is the fact that this card is a creature, which means that whenever you compare it to any of our spells that will fetch us up 2 lands, it is actually a lot more vulnerable to being removed. Now that we got our acceleration out of the way, let's dive into our big threats. These cards are the big boys and girls we'll be slamming onto the battlefield from as early as turn 4, immediately putting huge amounts of pressure onto our opponents and allowing us to start drawing cards of Bugenhagen's passive ability. Elder Gagagot. Now while this is only a 5 mana creature and it feels a little off curve for this deck, it is actually better than most 7-drops. It's a 6/6 Vigilance Reach Trample body that whenever it attacks or blocks will give you one of its 3 effects. The first option will generate you a 3/3 Beast token, which is a fantastic way to just grow your board even further. The second option will gain you 3 life, and the last option will just draw you a card, which is probably the most relevant of all 3 abilities. And thanks to this card having Vigilance, you can just attack with him, and after that you can just still use him as a blocker, which sets up for a really strong defensive layer. Because trust me, once you have your Elder Gagagot on the battlefield, no opponent will ever be attacking you because you will just be generating a ton of additional value. Brawlios of Fierce Band, a 5-drop creature that will have power and toughness equal to the total amount of lands you control. And since usually we will be controlling a total of 6 lands on turn 4 whenever we cast this, it will always be at least a 6/6 body that over the course of the game will just scale bigger and bigger with any additional land that we drop or whenever we cast any additional 4 mana acceleration spell. And the best part is that whenever this creature attacks, we will get to draw a card, and then we will get the option to put any land card from our hand straight onto the battlefield, giving us another really consistent stream of card draw, which is really important in a mono green deck while also allowing us to get some additional acceleration. A pretty potent card I didn't even know existed before building this deck. Territory Color, a 5 mana Eldrazi that does have that magic number of 7 power, meaning that whenever we do have this creature and our commander on the battlefield at the same time, we will get to draw a free card at the beginning of our upkeeps. And on top of being a really huge body for just 5 mana, this creature also has its own landfall ability. Whenever a land enters, we get to look at the top card of our library, and if it is a creature card, we get the option to reveal it and then put it into our hand. If we don't put a card into our hand, we either get the option to put it back on top or put it into our graveyard, giving us a really solid form of pseudo card advantage, especially since we are such a creature heavy deck, and also giving us a huge amount of card filtering. Because later in the game, if you for example play a land and you see that the top card of your deck is another basic land card that you don't need, you can just toss it into your graveyard and you will increase the chances of you drawing a really relevant card on your next turn. And now that we're on the topic of really good 7 power Eldrazi creatures, Anti-Causal Vestige. A creature that whenever it leaves the battlefield for any reason whatsoever will draw you a card and then allow you to put any permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield with mana value less or equal to the amount of lands you control. Already acting as a really solid body we can drop on turn 4, and whenever our opponents do deal with it we do get some additional value. And this card also has the warp mechanic, meaning that instead of casting it for 6 mana we get to cast it for 4 generic mana instead, but at the end of the turn it will go to exile, making this into an excellent creature to just squeeze in whenever you have 4 mana left on a later turn, because it will just enter and leave and replace itself by drawing you a card. Then you will be able to cheat a permanent from your hand into play for free. And on a later turn, if you don't have any place left, this card will always be able to be cast from exile if you warped it in, just making sure you always have a big threat to spend your mana on and essentially giving you 2 uses out of just 1 card. Ground Chuck and Dirtbag, a really massive 6 mana 8/8 trample creature, which in itself is already really solid, but on top of that this card also has an incredibly potent passive ability, and that is that whenever you tap any of your lands for mana you get to add 1 additional green mana to your mana pool. And let me tell you, this is one of the most brutal creatures you can drop on your turn 4, because whenever your opponents don't have any answers available and you do get to untap with it on your next turn, you will have like a gazillion mana available on your turn 5 and you will be able to dump your entire hand on the board, just taking over the game. They either deal with this creature before you get to untap with it, or they will just lose the game against it. Kogla, the Titan Ape, a classic 7 power creature that a ton of green decks run because it does have some incredible abilities. First up, whenever it enters the battlefield it will fight up to 1 creature you don't control, and since Kogla is such a massive creature body it essentially reads destroy target creature, just making it function as a removal spell. His second ability will, whenever you attack with Kogla, allow you to destroy up to 1 artifact or enchantment the defending player controls, simply allowing you to just deal with that problematic Ristic Studies, Mishkin's Deafening Silence, or a Ghostly Prison on the battlefield. And just those 2 abilities alone are the main reason why most decks are playing this creature. But on top of that he also has an activated ability that is actually quite good when combined with Bugenhagen. For 2 mana we can return any human we control to our hand and Kogla will gain indestructible until the end of turn. And since Bugenhagen has the human typing and we will always have him on the battlefield, this ability will allow us to protect our Kogla for just 2 mana. We'll be able to just recast our commander from our hand for 2 mana on a later turn anyways. Old One Eye, a 6 mana trample creature that will enter the battlefield with a 5/5 Tyranid friend, already giving us a total of 11 power and 11 toughness for just 6 mana, which is just an incredible deal. And passively this card is also a trample enabler because it will give trample to all of your other creatures. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter that you have 200 power on the board if your creatures don't have trample, because your opponents will just be using their 1/1 goblin or fairy tokens as chump blockers and you won't be able to get any combat damage through. Now while this creature is already a really good stat stick and a trample enabler, it also has a built-in recursion ability. If this creature is in our graveyard at the beginning of our first main phase, we get the option to discard 2 cards and just return this creature to our hand, which especially in the late game once you cast one of your card draw spells and you do have a ton of resources to waste, will make this into a recurring threat that your opponents will just have to deal with over and over again, and you will ensure that you always have a way to get trample onto your board. Coiled Great Worm, a 7 mana creature with an absolutely insane ability that will scale your entire board out of control if not dealt with. Whenever any creature you control deals combat damage, you get to put that many +1/+1 counters on it. And take note that this ability doesn't state combat damage to a player. So even whenever you're swinging with 5 10/10 creatures and your opponents are chump blocking them with 1/1s, all of your creatures will then still deal 10 damage each, and all of them will get a massive amount of 10 +1/+1 counters, which honestly is absolutely ridiculous in this type of mono green stompy deck. And the fact that this stat boost comes in the form of counters means that it doesn't even matter if your opponents do remove this creature, your board will just remain buffed permanently. Now talking about your opponents removing this creature, it also has a built-in recursion ability. By just removing 6 counters from amongst creatures you control, you get the ability to recast this card from your graveyard, which means that the only way your opponents will ever be able to permanently get rid of this creature is by exiling it. Otherwise, you can just recast this creature, swing with your entire board and get a huge amount of counters that you can use on a later turn to just recast your Quilt Great Worm and start a nightmare for your opponents all over again. Thunderfoot Ballet, a 5/5 trample creature with the Lieutenant ability, meaning that for as long as your commander is on the battlefield, it will give a +2/+2 stat boost to all creatures you control, and it will also give trample to your entire board, which essentially means that your entire board will get some sort of a permanent overrun effect attached to it for as long as you control both this creature and your commander. And having your commander on the battlefield in this deck is a really easy requirement to meet, because no one will be using their spot removal on your 2 mana Manador commander, and even whenever he does die against a board wipe or something, you will be able to recast them for just 4 mana. And a really cool thing about this card is the fact that it also gives a +2/+2 stat boost to itself, which will turn it into a 7 power creature, and thanks to our commander at the beginning of our upkeep, we will get to draw a free card of it. And another really classic mono-green win condition card we're playing is an Avenger of Zendikar, which whenever it enters a battlefield will generate you 1/0/1 plant token for each land you control. And since we'll always control 6 lands, if we do drop this on turn 4, it will generate us at least 6 plants. Now while these small plant tokens might seem really underwhelming, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control and we do have an Avenger of Zendikar, all of our plants will get a +1/+1 counter, just turning them into threats that will scale bigger and bigger over the course of the game, while also synergizing incredibly well with all of our land grab acceleration spells we're playing. Avenger of Zendikar really does give us a way to go wide with this deck in the form of massive creature tokens instead of just going tall with our big creature bodies. Canopy Gargantuan, a massive 7/7 flying Ward 2 dragon body that at the beginning of your upkeep for each other creature you control will put an amount of +1/+1 counters on it equal to that creature's toughness. And this is just another perfect example of a creature that your opponents do have to deal with on the turn it comes down, because it will generate you absurd amounts of value, essentially just permanently doubling up all of the stats of all creatures you control every single turn. And it also does apply to our commander, and since he does have 3 toughness, he will get a huge amount of counters and it will be incredibly hard to get him off the board. And this is a dragon creature I was talking about with Encroaching Dragonstorm that will enable us to get 2 uses out of it. Downglade Regent, a massive 8/8 creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will give us the Monarch emblem, meaning that at the beginning of our end step it will draw us a card, and whenever any other opponent does deal combat damage to us, they will get control of the Monarch emblem. Now since we are a creature heavy deck and we will always be ahead on the board from really early on, it will be incredibly hard for your opponents to ever get the Monarch emblem. And whenever you drop this creature on turn 4, it will essentially draw you 2 cards, one from the Monarch emblem and a second one from Bugenhagen's passive ability. And that's not even the main reason why this card is in the deck. For as long as we have the Monarch emblem, all of our permanents are hexproof, and this ability really does create some sort of a soft lock on your opponents, because if your opponents aren't able to deal combat damage to you and steal the Monarch emblem, they won't be able to use any targeted abilities or spot removal to get rid of your massive creatures. Giant Adavage, a 7 power trample creature that whenever it does deal combat damage to an opponent will create you a token copy of itself. Yet another creature your opponents do have to deal with immediately before you get the opportunity to swing with it, or it will just take over the game all by itself. You can just drop this on turn 4, and whenever you then swing with it you will have 2 of those on turn 5, the next turn you will have 4, then 8, 16, and it just goes exponential from there, and you can totally win the game by just swinging with this creature. And especially thanks to this card having the trample keyword built in, it will always get combat damage through and you will be able to generate some tokens of it. Glacier Godmaw, whenever it enters the battlefield it will generate you a lander token, which is an artifact that you can tap and sacrifice for 2 generic mana, and it will fetch you a basic land from your deck straight to the battlefield, giving us additional acceleration, another way to thin our deck, and also a way to get a trigger out of this creature's landfall ability, that whenever a land enters the battlefield will give your entire board a +1/+1 stat boost, vigilance and haste. The best part of this ability being the haste, because later in the game you will then be able to play any big threat creature in this section then follow up with a land drop, and since you will then immediately be able to swing with the creature you just played, you will get a huge amount of additional pressure onto your opponents. Jumbo Cactuar, a creature that whenever it attacks will get a plus 9999 power boost. Now I know this card really looks like a meme, but just hear me out. Since we are playing this many trample enablers that will give trample to our entire board, this card essentially reads: whenever you attack an opponent, that player instantly loses the game. And you must admit, it's pretty cool taking a player out of the game by dealing a total of 10,000 damage to them. Leatherhead, Iron Gator, a 5/5 trample haste creature that whenever it attacks will put 2+1/+1 counters on your entire board. A creature that will have an immediate impact from the turn that it comes down thanks to his haste, and that will just keep scaling up your board turn after turn by just putting more and more counters on it. And since this creature also does put 2 counters on itself whenever you play it on turn 4 and you swing with it, it is actually a 7 power creature for a commander and you will get to draw a card of it. Thorn Mammoth, a trample creature that whenever it or another creature you control enters the battlefield will fight any creature you don't control. And in this type of deck, this creature is a really oppressive removal engine, because it will have an immediate impact on the turn you play it, just allowing you to get any problematic creature off the board. And on your next turn, so whenever you do just play a creature which you were about to do anyways, you will get additional removal. Titan of Industry, a 7 power reach trample body that whenever it enters a battlefield will allow you to pick 2 out of its fantastic options. The first option will allow you to just straight up destroy any target artifact or enchantment. The second option will gain you 5 life. The third option will generate you a 4/4 creature token, just growing your board even further and triggering all of our draw engines. And the last option will put a shield counter on target creature you control, that whenever that creature would be destroyed the next time will make it survive and will just remove the shield counter, giving you a really solid layer of protection that will make it really hard for your opponents to get your big creatures off the board. And the fact that you get to pick 2 of these options whenever it comes in makes it into one of the most versatile cards in the entire deck. And my favorite card in the entire deck is Nissa, Ascended Animist, a 7 mana planeswalker that has the completed mechanic, meaning that instead of paying green mana for the Phyrexian mana pips in this cost, you can also pay 2 life. But for every mana pip you did replace, it will enter with 2 fewer starting loyalty counters. Now, since the entire point of this deck is having 7 mana available on turn 4, we will always be able to cast it for its full cost and make it enter with a massive 7 starting loyalty, which already makes it quite hard for your opponents to get this off the board. And the abilities on this planeswalker are just fantastic for what we're trying to do in this deck. Her +1 ability will generate us an XX Phyrexian token, X being equal to the amount of loyalty on Nissa. And since changing the loyalty of a planeswalker is a cost for the ability, whenever you activate this with Nissa being at 7 loyalty, she will go to 8 loyalty first and then generate you a massive 8/8 Phyrexian token, which if you're able to drop this planeswalker on turn 4 will already give you a massive blocker to protect her with, and will also guarantee you a Bugenhagen trigger. By just removing 1 loyalty from Nissa, you get to destroy target artifact or enchantment on the battlefield, just giving you an additional way to deal with any problematic things that your opponents might be doing. And by removing 7 loyalty counters, you do get the ultimate overrun effect, because it will give all of your creatures +X, X being the amount of forest you control and trample until the end of turn. So you can just drop your Nissa on turn 4 and start generating some tokens, and on a later turn you can use this ability as a win condition, or later in the game if you already have an established board state and you draw into your Nissa, you can just play her for 7 mana, and since you will always control a huge amount of forest, it will give like an 8/8 or a 10/10 stat boost to your entire board, and you will just be able to win the game on the spot. Kamal, Heart of Kroza, an 8 mana creature that at the beginning of combat on your turn will give your entire board an overrun effect, just a +3/+3 stat boost and trample until the end of turn. And as you can imagine, having a permanent overrun effect on your entire board is one of the best win conditions in the entire deck. And Kamal doesn't even stop there, because on top of that he also has an activated ability that does scale really well with his passive ability, because for 2 mana you can animate any land you control control into a 1/1 haste indestructible vigilance creature. An ability that later in the game, once you do have a gazillion mana, will allow you to animate all of your lands. Kamal's overrun effect will also apply to these lands, turning them into 4/4 creatures, and you will be able to swing with a huge amount of bodies. And thanks to your lands also gaining the indestructible keyword, it doesn't even matter if your opponents are blocking them, you won't be losing them in the process. Stonehoof Chieftain, an 8 mana trample indestructible creature that whenever any other creature you control attacks will also give it trample and indestructible until the end of turn, making it act as a really solid trample enabler, just preventing your opponents from chump blocking your huge creatures. It will prevent your opponents from destroying your creatures in combat by using death touch blockers, because all of your creatures will gain indestructible. And my favorite part about this card is the fact that it does have the indestructible keyword itself, making it into a trample enabler that's really hard for your opponents to ever get off the board. And a card that I haven't seen around for the last 10 years is the Terastodon, which is a 9-power creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow you to destroy up to 3 non-creature permanents. The controllers of those permanents will get to generate a 3/3 elephant token in return. Now, even though most decks aren't playing this card anymore due to the really high mana cost, in this deck we will easily be able to get it out by turn 6. And the value it can generate you is just absurd, because at that point in the game a lot of opponents will have some really valuable artifacts and enchantments on the battlefield. You can use it to blow up a Warstorm Surge, a Shemil, and a Field of the Dead. The best part is that you can destroy all 3 at the same time, just generating you a huge tempo swing. Apex Altisar, a massive 10/10 creature body that whenever it enters a battlefield will fight up to 1 creature you don't control. And whenever this creature is dealt damage from any source, it will give you an additional trigger and you will be able to fight again. And this ability does set up for some sort of a chain reaction. You can just fight something, Altisar will take damage, enabling you to fight again, and you can just keep continue doing this until this creature takes 10 damage. And if you use this card in a really smart way, it does act as some sort of a one-sided board wipe effect that will leave behind a 10/10 body. Just start by using this effect on some low power creatures, then go to the higher power ones, and then just make sure your Altisar has 1 toughness left and you will be left with a 10/10 body. Kozilek, the Broken Reality. Whenever you cast this massive creature, up to 2 players have to manifest 2 cards from their hands, meaning they have to put them onto the battlefield face down, and they will be 2/2 colored creatures. If the manifested cards are creature spells, they can be turned face up at any time by paying their mana cost. Then for each card manifested due to this ability, you will get to draw 1 card. Now usually how you will use this ability in practice is just target an opponent and target yourself. Whatever your opponents put into play doesn't really matter, and you can use it to just put some creatures onto the battlefield face down that you can turn face up later anyways. And essentially Kozilek will then just draw you 4 cards whenever you cast him, which is some really incredible value. On top of that, he also has a passive ability that will give all colorless creatures you control a +3/+2 stat boost, meaning that this creature will give you a total of 16 power and 14 toughness entering the battlefield for just casting him, on top of already drawing you 4 cards. And the biggest creature to rule them all is an Apex Devastator. For a total of 10 mana, you get a creature that has Cascade, 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 meaning that whenever you cast it, you get to exile the top cards of your library until you hit a non-land card with a lower mana value, and then you are able to cast that card for free. And this process will happen a total of 4 times. Now, since this creature has the highest mana value in this entire deck, whatever you hit, you will get to put into play. And let me just give you an example of how explosive this effect can be. Let's say you hit your Kamal, a Glacial Godmaw, an Avenger of Zendikar, and an acceleration spell. First, you will get a huge amount of plant tokens thanks to the Avenger. You will then get 2 additional lands entering the battlefield thanks to your acceleration spell, buffing up your plants even further. Those lands entering will then also give you Glacial Godmaw triggers, giving your entire board a stat boost and haste. Then at the beginning of your combat, you will get an additional stat boost thanks to Kamal's overrun effect, and you will just be able to swing at your opponents and instantly win the game. Before we continue, I want to give a huge shout out to all of the YouTube members. The amount of support I've been receiving in the past couple of months has been absolutely incredible, and it is what allows me to pour all of my love and passion for Magic into these weekly deck tech videos. So if you do want to give additional support to the channel, make sure to check out the membership program. All members will get early access to the deck lists, sneak peeks of all the projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. But no pressure at all, just you being here and watching the videos already means a lot to me. And of course a big shout out to the Discord as well. This Bugenhagen deck was actually built together with another deck builder I've known personally for about 10 years and I do have a lot of respect for. Shaddington. He's honestly the king of these 2-4-7 curve decks, and he has a really potent Susan Foreman and Ruby Daring Tracker deck that really pushed this archetype to its limits. So if you're interested in this playstyle and you want to dive deeper into these builds, definitely come and check out the Discord. We genuinely have some of the best deck builders on the entire planet in there. Next up we have the card advantage. While mono green doesn't have access to some of the fancier card draw options that other colors do have, we do have our own ways of drawing cards. The cards in this section combined with Bugenhagen's passive ability will make sure we can keep the pressure on without ever running out of gas. Up the Beanstalk, a 2-mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield or whenever we cast any creature with mana value 5 or greater will draw us a card. And since the entire point of this deck is playing these high mana value creatures, we will be able to get a huge amount of value out of this. Now obviously we won't be casting any of these draw engines early in the game, because we will always drop our commander on turn 2, accelerate on turn 3 and drop a big threat on turn 4. After we did all of that, we will only have a couple of cards in our hand remaining, and that is the exact time we want to start dropping these card draw enchantments. Elemental Bond. Whenever any creature with power 3 or higher enters the battlefield under our control, we get to draw a card, which has exactly the same function as the previous card, but this time it will trigger on ETB, which means that it will even trigger off tokens. So whenever you now create a token with your Titan of Industry, with your Old One-Eye, or with your Nissa, you will get to draw additional cards of that. Garruk's Uprising, a card that is basically the improved version of an Elemental Bond. Also drawing you a card whenever any creature with power 4 or greater enters a battlefield. Whenever you cast this card and you already control a creature with 4 or greater power, it will act as a cantrip by just drawing you a new card and replacing itself. And what pushes this card totally over the top is the fact that it will give all of your creatures trample, which as I already mentioned is incredibly important in this deck. Outcaster Trailblazer, a creature that just like a Garruk's Uprising will also draws a card whenever anything with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, and whenever this creature enters it will also generate us 1 mana, which just might make the difference and allow you to squeeze in an additional removal or acceleration spell, generating you even more value. Beast Whisperer, whenever you cast any creature spell with this on the battlefield you get to draw a card. Another really solid draw engine, albeit a little weaker than the previous options, because it does come attached to a creature body, making it a little more vulnerable to removal. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, a 4-mana 1/1 squirrel that can be countered, is indestructible, has to attack each combat if able, and whenever any creature you control does deal combat damage to an opponent you get to draw a card. Now unlike all of the previous card draw engines, he won't generate a card advantage whenever we cast or play a creature, but instead he will reward us with card advantage for swinging with all of our creatures. And unlike a Beast Whisperer, he doesn't have the problem of being more vulnerable to creature removal because he does come with the indestructible keyword. Return of the Wild Speaker, a 5-mana instant speed spell with 2 options. The first option will allow you to draw cards equal to the greatest power amongst creatures you control, which as you can imagine in this deck is always going to be 7 or more, just instantly refilling your entire hand. And the second option will give all non-human creatures you control a +3/+3 stat boost until the end of turn, making this into an excellent card draw spell that you can also use as a win condition, especially with all of the trample enablers we're playing in this deck. And now it's time for me to showcase you one of the strongest cards in the entire Lorwyn set you've never heard about. Spry and Mighty. Whenever you cast this 5-mana spell you get to pick 2 of your creatures. You will then get to draw X cards, and both of those creatures will get a +X/+X stat boost and trample until the end of turn, X being the difference in their powers. And this card is just ridiculous when combined with Bugenhagen, because let's say you do have a 7 power creature and your commander on the battlefield. Whenever you then cast a spell, the value will be equal to 6, just drawing you a massive amount of cards and allowing you to deal a massive amount of damage to your opponents. And once you are able to start buffing up your board with counters with a Quilled Great Worm, for example, the amount of value that this simple spell can generate you is just crazy. Disciple of Realize, a 6 mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow you to sacrifice another creature. When you do, you get to draw cards and gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Now later in the game, once you do have a huge amount of mana available but no cards to use it on left in your hand, you can just play your Disciple and sacrifice one of your 7 power creatures and you will instantly get to draw 7 new cards, which will then generate you a huge amount of value and will usually turn the tides of battle. Now the main reason this card is included in the deck is because it is an MDFC land, meaning that whenever we don't need its effect, we can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for 1 green mana, and we can even make it enter the battlefield untapped for 3 life. There's really no reason to not be including these in your decks, because they just function as regular land cards, and if you do draw into them in the late game, they do provide you with an additional benefit that might change the outcome of the game. Rishkar's Expertise, a card that just like a Return of the Wild Speaker will draw you cards equal to the greatest power amongst creatures you control. And after that effect has happened, you also get to cast any card from your hand with mana value 5 or less for free, which will instantly refuel your entire hand and then will instantly enable you to follow up with any of the cards you just drew that are some acceleration spells or some value enchantments. And the last card in this section is a Soul of the Harvest, a 6/6 trample creature that will draw you a card whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield. Now while obviously the value on this card is kinda limited by it saying non-token, it is still a really solid card draw engine and it does come attached to a big creature body you can start beating your opponents with. The saddest thing about this card is that it doesn't have 7 power and we can't actually use our Bugenhagen's ability to draw cards of it. Next up we have the support section. These are the cards that didn't fit into any other category but still generated some crazy value. Whether it's cheating creatures into play, giving us access to recursion, or give us extra consistency, these are the cards that make the deck run a lot smoother. Bala Get Recovery. For 3 mana we get to return any card from our graveyard to our hand. Now no matter what table you are playing at, you will always end up with some valuable cards in your graveyard, either due to being removed, being milled, or being discarded. And this simple card then just simply gives you a way to get them back. Now the main reason this card is included in the deck is because whenever you don't need its effect, you can just play its backside, which is a simple land. And since in this deck we don't really have any turn 1 plays, it's perfectly fine to just make this land enter tapped on your turn 1. Monstrous Vortex, a 4 mana enchantment that whenever we cast any creature spell with power 5 or greater will allow us to discover X. X being that creature's power. And Discover functions in a really similar way to Cascade. We get to exile the top cards of our library until we hit a non-land card with mana value equal or less than X, and then we get the option to either cast that card for free or put it into our hand. Now obviously with us playing this many high power creatures, this enchantment will generate us some crazy value, because whenever we now cast something, we will essentially get to cast another spell for free. But what makes this card truly ridiculous is that whenever you discover into a creature with power 5 or greater and you do cast it for free, this enchantment will just trigger again and it will set up some sort of a chain reaction. You can just cast your Groundchuck and Dirtbag, which will give you a Discover 8 trigger. If you then from the top hit a Giant Edifice, you can just cast it for free, which will give you a Discover 7 trigger. If you then from the top hit a Glacier Godmaw, you will be able to cast it for free and just get another Discover 6 trigger. And this chain just keeps on going for as long as you do keep hitting high power creatures. Essentially meaning that if you do get really lucky, a single trigger of a Monstrous Vortex can just put half of your library onto the battlefield. Ticket Elemental. You can essentially view this card as a 7 mana creature because we will always be casting it with its Kicker ability, which whenever we do, whenever this creature enters a battlefield, allows us to reveal the top cards of our library until we hit a creature spell, and then we get to put it onto the battlefield for free, making this into a really explosive creature we can play on turn 4 that will give us a free 4/4 creature body, and we can then even hit some of the biggest creatures in our deck that do cost more than 7 mana, like a Terastodon, which will then just allow us to blow up one specific player's lands. We can use it to get out our Kamal on turn 4, or get our indestructible Stonehoof Chieftain on the battlefield. battlefield. See the Unwritten, a 6 mana spell that will allow us to look at the top 8 cards of our library and pick one creature and put it onto the battlefield for free. And cards like this are the perfect place on turn 4 instead of playing a 7-drop creature from your hand. Due to the fact that you get to pick from amongst the top 8 cards of your deck, you can just pick the creature you need most at the current given board state, making it really versatile. And the best part about this card is that it also has the ferocious mechanic, meaning that later in the game, once you do already control a 4-power creature, you get to pick 2 of those creatures and put them onto the battlefield for free, making this into a spell that will help you dig into your library, and for just 6 mana it can cheat up to like 15 mana worth of permanents on the field. Vivian's Invocation, a card with exactly the same effect as the previous one that will allow you to look at the top 7 cards of your library and pick one of those creatures and put them onto the battlefield. Then that creature that you just cheated into play will fight up to one creature you don't control. It's just the perfect turn 4 play to get a massive creature on the battlefield while at the same time also removing one of your opponent's creatures. And another card with a similar effect is Stern Timber Symbiosis. For 7 mana you get to look at the top 7 and cheat a creature into play, and if you don't need its effect you can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for 1 green mana and even enters untapped for 3 life. There's really no downsides to including this in the deck. Tooth and Nail, a true classic that is just the perfect fit for this deck. For 7 mana you can either go tutor up 2 creatures from your deck straight to your hand, or you can choose to put 2 creature cards from your hand straight onto the battlefield. Now I can guarantee you, if you do get some sort of a god hand and you did manage to set up the 2 for 7 curve, whenever you cast a spell on turn 4 and have 2 big creatures in your hand, you will just straight up win the game because the value will just be way too much for your opponents to deal with. And later in the game you can also cast this card for a total of 9 mana by using its Entwine mechanic, which will allow you to first go tutor up 2 creatures and then put those 2 creatures straight onto the battlefield. Yeah, you can just go tutor up whatever you need most at the current given board state, or some really crazy 2-card combos, like an Avenger of Zendikar and a Thorn Mammoth, which will just give you a huge amount of fight triggers, or just any huge threat in the deck like a Canopy Gargantuan and a Downglade Regent, which will make sure it does have protection for your next turn. Next up we have the protection and the interaction. While our main game plan is applying pressure, we still do need ways to protect our value cards and disrupt our opponent's game plans. These are the cards that will enable us to stay ahead once we established our advantage. Smuggler's Surprise. Whenever we cast this card we get the option to pick 1 or more of its additional costs. By paying 2 additional generic mana we get to mill the top 4 cards of our library and then return up to 2 creature or land cards to our hand. Now while this ability really isn't all that good by itself, it does have a really good synergy with the second option, that just like a Tooth and Nail will enable us to put 2 creature cards from our hand straight onto the battlefield, enabling us to get some really crazy mana efficient value once we do have 2 big threats in our hand. And the main reason why this card is in the deck is the last option, that will give all creatures we control with power 4 or greater both hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, which baseline you can cast for just 2 mana, already making this card as efficient as a heroic intervention. Now the best thing about the spree mechanic is that you get the ability to combine any of these modes. Since in the late game we will always have a huge amount of mana available, you can then just cast this as a massive 9 mana spell that will give you all of its effects at once. Contest of Claws, a 2 mana spell that will allow one of our creatures to deal damage to any creature we don't control, which will essentially act as a removal spell, and if any excess amount of damage was dealt this way we do get to discover that amount. Now already by itself just playing a 2 mana fight spell is already incredibly efficient, but thanks to us always having huge power creatures on the board, the amount of value you can get from this simple spell is just bananas. You can just use it on any of your high power creatures to remove a low toughness commander. You will then usually get a discover 6 or 7 trigger and you will get to cheat an additional massive permanent into play, while at the same time also disrupting your opponent's game plan. Hunter's Talent, a 2 mana class card that just like the previous spell, whenever it enters a battlefield will allow you to remove a creature. Already really solid by itself, but you also get the ability to invest additional mana into this and make it go to its next levels. The second level will allow you whenever you attack to give one of your creatures a +1 power boost and trample until the end of turn, which will just ensure you can get combat damage through with your biggest creatures, and whenever it gets to its final stage for just 4 additional mana at the beginning of your end step. If you do control a creature with power 4 or greater, you will get to draw a card. So a very simple removal spell that is also a trample enabler and a card draw engine. Really fantastic value on this one. Archdruid's Charm, arguably one of the strongest and most versatile spells in existence, but many decks aren't playing this due to the 3 green mana pips. Whenever you cast this instant speed spell, you get to pick 1 out of 3 options. You can either go tutor up a land to the battlefield or a creature card to your hand, which will just enable you to go fetch up the perfect creature to deal with whatever the current board state is. The second option is another fight spell you can use as a removal tool to deal with creatures. And the last option allows you to exile either an artifact or an enchantment. And since this is exile based removal, you can even use it to get rid of some indestructible enchantments like the Terros Gods. Bridgeworks Battle, a 3 mana spell that will give a +2/+2 stat boost to a creature you control, and then it will fight a creature you don't control, giving you an additional way to deal with some problematic creatures. Or whenever you do draw into this early in the game and you don't need its effect, you can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for green mana and even enters untapped for 3 life. Khalni Ambush, a card with nearly the same effect as the previous card, the main differences being that it won't give a stat boost, but you can cast it on instant speed. And it's also an MDFC land, but this time it doesn't have the option that you can pay the life to make it enter untapped. Agonasaur Rex, for just 5 mana you get a whopping 8/8 trample body, which you can just use as a massive creature body to start beating your opponents with. But the reason why this card is in the protection section is due to its cycling ability, meaning that whenever this card is in your hand on instant speed, you get the ability to pay 3 mana and discard this card. It will then replace itself by drawing you a new card, and whenever you do cycle this card, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto a creature you control, and it will both gain trample and indestructible until the end of turn. A creature you can either use as a massive beatstick, a way to protect your creatures from any sort of spot removal or board wipes, or as a way to just surprise your opponents and give trample to one of your creatures and just lethal them out of the game. Spearbreaker Behemoth, one of my favorite cards in the entire deck. It's a 7 mana indestructible creature with an activated ability for just 1 generic mana that will give target creature with power 5 or greater indestructible until the end of turn. Yeah, this card is just absolutely nuts for any sort of green stompy deck. You can just establish your board of high power creatures, and you can then just always leave little bits of mana open to protect them with the activated ability of this card, giving you protection from spot removal and from any sort of board wipe, which really can create some sort of a soft lock that your opponents won't ever be able to get your creatures off the board unless they have exile based removal. And the fact that this creature already has indestructible itself permanently attached to it makes it incredibly hard for your opponents to ever get rid of it. And the last card in this section is an Azuri's Predation, a massive 8 mana spell that for each creature your opponents control will generate you a 4/4 creature token. And after those tokens are created, they will fight up to 1 different creature that each opponent does control. Now usually whenever you cast a spell, it does function as a one-sided board wipe, just destroying any sort of board state your opponents just built up, while at the same time also leaving you with a huge amount of 4/4 creature tokens that you will just be able to buff up and swing with on your next turn and deal a huge amount of damage with them. And if you have a simple card draw enchantment like an elemental bond on the battlefield, for each creature token you do generate with this spell, you will get to draw 1 card, which usually will result in you drawing like 15 cards of this, and you will get to dig really deep into your library and get a ton of resources. And finally we have the lands. Since we are a monocolored budget deck, we are keeping things really simple. Let's start by going over our utility lands. Amonkhet Raceway, a nature drift land that whenever it enters a battlefield will start your engines, meaning that you will go to 1 speed, and whenever any opponent loses life during your turn, you will get to increase your speed by 1. And once you're able to get to a total of 4 maximum speed, you will be able to tap this land to give target creature you control haste until the end of turn. Now since we are a mono green deck and we will be fetching up a huge amount of forests, we don't really care about any sort of colorless lands. And while getting to 4 speed might not be the fastest thing to do in this deck, once you got a couple of hits in the late game, this is an additional haste enabler on something as simple as a land, which might actually make a huge difference in the late game by you instantly being able to swing with one of your big threats. Ash Barrens, a land that we can tap for 1 colorless mana, and it also has basic land cycling 1, meaning whenever this land is in our hand we can pay 1 generic mana, discard it, and we will be able to fetch up any basic land from our deck to our hand. Now while this might seem like a really weird card for the deck, there will be a lot of turns where we do have 1 spare mana left. We can then just discard this card and thin our deck even further by removing a forest for it, which in the late game will then slightly increase the odds we draw into relevant cards instead of basic lands. Fabled Passage, a land we can sacrifice to go fetch up any basic land from our deck, and it will even enter the battlefield untapped if we do control 4 or more lands. A card we can just crack on turn 1, which will just get a tapped basic forest, which doesn't matter anyways, or in the late game it will thin our deck even further and the land that does fetch up won't even enter tapped, basically giving us no real downsides. Horizon of Progress, a land we can just sacrifice in the late game once we don't need it anymore to draw a free card. While for 3 mana and tapping this land we get to put any land card from our hand straight onto the battlefield, which will give us additional acceleration in the mid game or the late game after we played a massive card draw spell, and it also gives you an option to get additional landfall triggers on instant speed and really surprise your opponents. Bonder's Enclave and War Room, both are lands that will tap for a colorless mana, and for 3 mana and tapping them we can use them to draw a card. Just like I mentioned, since we are in mono green we will take any sort of card draw option we can get our hands on. Mossword Bridge, a land with the Hideaway 4 mechanic, meaning that whenever it enters the battlefield we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library, then pick one of those cards and exile it. And then for 1 green mana and tapping this land we get to cast the exiled card for absolutely free, but we can only activate it if we do control a total of 10 power on the battlefield, which as you can imagine in this deck is a really easy requirement to meet. Just imagine playing this as your land on turn 1 and then exiling an Apex Devastator with it. On a later turn you will then just need 2 creatures on the battlefield and you will be able to cast your Apex Devastator for just 1 green mana, which is some absolutely ridiculous value. And just like I mentioned, we're also playing 1 desert in the deck, being a Scavenger Grounds, which is a card that for 2 mana and sacrificing it will allow you to exile all graveyards. And especially nowadays in modern day Magic with this many decks relying on using their graveyard, this simple effect can totally win you the game. You can use it against a Spellslinger player that's about to cast their entire graveyard by using a Past in Flames. You can use it to prevent the Reanimator player from getting back their Elesh Norn, or you can even use it against some landfall strategies like a Necrobloom deck to just prevent them from ever getting their lands back. And if you remember from the beginning of the video, you can use your Map the Frontier to just go tutor up this land whenever you need it. And for basics we're playing a total of 24 forests. And that's it for my Bugenhagen Wise Elder deck tech. A commander that looks very underwhelming at first sight, but once you understand how the 2-4-7 curve works you realize how incredibly consistent and potent this deck can really be. Just having that massive 7 mana available on turn 4 and dropping huge threats before your opponents are even ready is a really unique playstyle that can totally take over the game if left unchecked. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a globe emoji in the comments below. Share this video with your entire playgroup, hit the like button, hit subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's video. Thanks for watching, enjoy curving from 2 into 4 into 7 and I will see you in the next one.